In a small town courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension as Cassandra Green stood at the center of the room, her mind focused and calm. Yet the stakes higher than she had ever imagined. Today was no ordinary day for Cassandra. It was a day that would set the course of her life on a new path, but not one she had envisioned. As she looked around the courtroom, she saw faces both familiar and unfamiliar. Some were there to support her, others to witness the trial that had become the center of local controversy. Cassandra was no stranger to the legal world. Her career had been marked by hard work and dedication to civil rights. Causes her reputation as a fierce advocate for justice had earned her the respect of many, even those who disagreed with her politics. But today, the courtroom held an unspoken weight. The judge presiding over her trial was Judge Richard Hawkins, a man known for his strict and conservative views on the law. He was a man whose decisions often sparked debate and whose opinions were seldom challenged. Cassandra had heard the whispers. She knew the judge was not inclined to support her cause, not by a long shot, but she had never let fear guide her decisions. Even when the odds were stacked against her, Cassandra had faced countless battles in her career, but none felt quite like this one. She had worked tirelessly for years advocating for criminal justice reform, standing up for marginalized communities, and pushing back against a system that often failed to protect the vulnerable. She had been a voice for the voiceless, yet here she was in a courtroom fighting for her own future, fighting against a system that seemed determined to break her. Her defense attorney was ready with the strongest arguments they had gathered. They had meticulously prepared for every angle of the case. But despite the solid defense, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal battle. It was personal. There was something about the way Judge Hawkins looked at her, something in his eyes that made her uneasy. She could sense his disdain for her work and her beliefs. She had always known there would be resistance to the changes she wanted to see in the world. But today it felt different. Today it felt like the fight was not just about winning a case. It was about changing everything. Cassandra had fought her whole career for change, was in the air. It had been for years. But this was the moment when it felt real, when it felt like the world would have to reckon with her vision for justice. As the trial proceeded, Cassandra found herself weighing every word, every gesture. The stakes felt higher than ever before. Little did Judge Hawkins know that Cassandra was more than just a lawyer standing trial today. She was also a woman who had recently been nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States, and her nomination had made waves in political circles. But Cassandra had kept this quiet. She hadn't shared it with anyone in the courtroom, not even her defense team. It wasn't the right time. The stakes were too high, and the trial was too unpredictable. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, Cassandra knew one thing for certain: this trial wasn't just about her. It was about the future of justice itself. And whatever the outcome, she would stand firm in her belief that change was not just possible but inevitable. Cassandra Green was no stranger to pressure. Her entire career had been built on navigating challenges and overcoming obstacles that others believed were insurmountable. From a young age, she had been determined to prove that someone like her could make a difference in a world that often overlooked people like her. Her journey hadn't been easy, but her dedication had paid off. She had become a leading voice in the fight for civil rights and criminal justice reform. Her reputation spread across the country as a brilliant and tireless attorney, and yet despite her many accomplishments, she had always felt that there was more to be done, more battles to fight, and more injustices to right. Cassandra had never been one to settle for the status quo. She knew that real change took time and that it would require not only her efforts, but the efforts of those around her. That was why her nomination to the Supreme Court had come as both a blessing and a burden to her. It was an honor beyond measure, but it also placed her squarely in the crosshairs of the very system she had spent her life trying to change. The nomination process had been long and grueling, filled with scrutiny and skepticism from those who doubted whether someone like her was fit for such a prestigious role. Many believed that her background as a civil rights attorney would make her an unconventional choice for the Supreme Court, and yet Cassandra knew that it was precisely this background that made her the right choice. She had seen the flaws in the system firsthand and understood the need for reform more deeply than anyone else in the room. She had spent years advocating for marginalized communities, fighting against racial bias and inequality, but she also knew that her rise to the highest court would not come without resistance. Even now, with the trial looming and the judge preparing to make his decision. She couldn't afford to take her eyes off the bigger picture. Her dreams of serving on the Supreme Court had been a long time in the making, but they were fragile. They could all come crashing down if this trial went wrong. Cassandra had always believed that the law should serve the people, not the powerful, and she had made it her life's work to challenge a system that often favored the wealthy and the privileged. But as she sat in that courtroom facing Judge Hawkins, she couldn't help but feel that her own future was now in the hands of someone who didn't understand her cause, someone who didn't believe in the changes she was fighting for. And so she sat there listening to the proceedings with a sense of quiet determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by the justice system, fighting for the communities that had been silenced and ignored for too long. Her work had always been about giving a voice to the voiceless, and today that voice had to be louder than ever. It was not just about this trial, it was about the future of the entire system of justice. The decisions made today would have repercussions far beyond this courtroom. As Cassandra's attorney continued to present their case, she glanced at the judge and knew that no matter what happened next, she would continue her fight. She would not let this moment define her. She would take it as one step closer to the larger goal of creating a more just and equitable world, one where a woman like her could sit not just in this courtroom, but in the halls of the highest court in the land. As the courtroom filled with an almost unbearable silence, Cassandra's heart beat steadily, but her mind raced. She had been through tough situations before, cases that tested her resolve, but today felt different. There was something about Judge Hawkins' demeanor that unsettled her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As the hours ticked by, the arguments came to an end, and the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Cassandra remained composed, her face a mask of determination. She knew she had done everything within her power to make a solid case, but she also knew that the trial wasn't just about facts. It was about perception, about power. And today, it seemed like power was on the judge's side. Judge Hawkins adjusted his glasses and stood up, his voice cutting through the tense air. After considering the evidence and the arguments made by both sides, he began, his tone stern and unwavering. "I have come to a decision." Cassandra held her breath. She had expected a fair ruling, one that acknowledged the peaceful nature of her protest and the cause she was fighting for. But as the judge continued, his words felt cold, dismissive, and sharp. "I hereby sentence you to 6 months of community service and a fine of $5,000 for your involvement in the protest," he said, his voice almost mechanical. "This was an unlawful disruption, and while I respect your right to protest, it cannot be done at the expense of the peace and order of our community." Cassandra's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to remain still, her face betraying nothing. The sentence was far more severe than she had anticipated. She had hoped for a mild penalty, perhaps even a dismissal of charges based on the evidence of her good character. Instead, the judge's decision felt like a calculated blow, one meant not only to punish, but to humiliate. The ruling felt personal, like a message meant to send her a warning. She was an activist, a woman of color, and now she was being shown her place. Her attorney, who had been sitting quietly beside her, stood up quickly, his voice rising in disbelief. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this sentence is excessive. We request a reconsideration, especially given the nature of this case. Cassandra Green has spent her entire career fighting for justice, and we believe this decision does not reflect the principles of fairness we hold dear." The judge, unmoved, waved him off. "The decision stands," he said, cutting off any further argument. "Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down, and the room erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Cassandra felt the weight of the decision settle heavily on her shoulders. As she stood to leave the courtroom, she locked eyes with the judge for just a moment, but there was no hint of remorse in his gaze. In that instant, Cassandra understood something deeply. This wasn't just about a protest or a trial. This was about something much larger. Her fight for justice had always been about challenging the system, and now, it seemed that the system was fighting back in ways she hadn't fully expected. Outside the courthouse, the media was already gathering. News outlets had caught wind of the trial, and reporters began to shout questions as Cassandra exited. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one of them masked, her camera capturing every moment. Cassandra took a deep breath, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She was used to being in the public eye, but this was different. This was more than just a case. This was a battle for the future, for the changes she had worked so hard to bring about. And no matter how hard the system tried to break her, Cassandra Green would not back down. The days following the trial felt like an endless whirlwind for Cassandra. The sentence was everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, in the opening segments of news broadcasts, and across social media platforms. Her name, once associated with the fight for justice and reform, now carried an uncomfortable weight. It wasn't just about her anymore. The world had latched onto her case as a symbol of something much larger, a battleground between progress and the status quo. At first, Cassandra kept a low profile. She focused on preparing for the community service she had been sentenced to, taking it in stride, determined to honor the decision without letting it derail her plans. But behind closed doors, the conversation was anything but quiet. People who had long admired her work rallied to her cause. Legal experts, civil rights leaders, and even political figures began to speak out, condemning the judge's harsh verdict. They questioned whether the sentence was based on the law or on personal biases, and many saw it as a direct attack on the very values Cassandra had spent her life defending. The news spread like wildfire, and as the protests grew, so did the calls for justice. The media began to scrutinize Judge Hawkins with a magnifying glass. Who was this man, and why had he decided to make an example of Cassandra? His past rulings came under the spotlight, with journalists pointing out his controversial decisions in cases involving people of color or social activists. The public began to ask questions, real questions, about his impartiality. Was his judgment truly based on the law, or had he allowed personal biases to shape his decision? The social media movement in support of Cassandra was swift and powerful. Hashtags like #JusticeForCassandra and #PunishTheSystem began trending, with people across the country joining in solidarity. Activists held peaceful rallies outside courthouses and government buildings, demanding accountability for the judge's actions. Cassandra's legal team filed for an appeal, but the more they dug into the case, the more they realized that this was no ordinary legal battle. It was a fight for the very soul of the justice system. Cassandra, however, remained steady. The media coverage was both a blessing and a curse. She had the platform to speak out against the injustices of the legal system, but it also meant that every move she made was being watched. She continued to participate in public rallies and interviews, always staying true to her cause. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. The judge's decision was too deliberate, too personal. There was something about the way he had looked at her, as if he had already decided she was guilty of more than just the charges against her. And then, as the days passed, the truth began to emerge. Cassandra was not only fighting to clear her name, she was also in the midst of a far more powerful struggle. The news broke that Cassandra Green, the woman being punished for her activism, was not just an attorney, but a nominee for the Supreme Court of the United States. The revelation sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Suddenly, the stakes were much higher. People across the country began to ask themselves, was the punishment for her protest just a coincidence, or was it an attempt to derail her Supreme Court nomination? Cassandra's name now stood at the intersection of legal reform and political power. Her case had become a rallying cry for those who believed the system needed to change, and the more the public learned about her potential rise to the Supreme Court, the more they rallied to her side. This was no longer just about a courtroom verdict. It was about the future of justice in America, and Cassandra Green was at the forefront of that battle. As the public outcry over Cassandra's sentence grew, so did the scrutiny of Judge Hawkins. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into his background, uncovering details that had previously been overlooked. What they found sent shockwaves through both the legal community and the general public. Hawkins, it seemed, had a long history of rulings that appeared to disproportionately affect marginalized communities. His decisions in cases involving racial justice, gender equality, and social activism had consistently leaned in favor of the powerful and the status quo, and his ruling in Cassandra's case seemed to fit into this troubling pattern. One of the most shocking revelations came when it was uncovered that Hawkins had attended secret meetings with conservative political groups in the months leading up to Cassandra's trial. These groups, known for their staunch opposition to progressive judicial reforms, had been vocal in their disdain for Cassandra's Supreme Court nomination. The connection was clear. Judge Hawkins was not just an impartial figure upholding the law. He was a man with a vested interest in preventing someone like Cassandra from gaining a seat on the nation's highest court. His decision to sentence her harshly wasn't just about the protest, it was about sending a message. He was going to make sure she paid the price for challenging the system. The public was outraged. Calls for an investigation into Hawkins' conduct grew louder, and soon an official inquiry was launched into his judicial record. Activists, legal professionals, and even politicians from across the political spectrum began to demand accountability. For many, it was no longer just about Cassandra's case. It was about the integrity of the justice system itself. How many other judges were out there, using their positions of power to push political agendas and punish those who dared to challenge them? In the midst of this storm, Cassandra remained remarkably composed. The pressure on her was immense, but she had weathered storms before. What was happening now wasn't just about her. It was about the broader fight for justice, equality, and fairness in the country. As the public debate raged, she continued to advocate for the changes she had always fought for, refusing to let the personal attacks derail her mission. She spent long hours meeting with her legal team, poring over case law and strategy, preparing for the next steps in her fight. But as much as the legal side of things consumed her, the political side loomed larger by the day. With each passing hour, the prospect of her Supreme Court nomination hung in the balance. The more the media uncovered about Judge Hawkins and his ties to anti-reform factions, the more public pressure mounted. It became clear that Cassandra's trial had turned into a flashpoint, a moment when the system itself was being questioned. Yet even as the investigation into Hawkins intensified, the powers that be were hesitant to act. Those who had initially supported Cassandra's nomination began to waver. Some feared that the controversy surrounding her case would jeopardize her confirmation. Others worried that a woman who had already become a symbol of resistance might be too polarizing for the Supreme Court. The political establishment was watching closely, but the stakes had never been higher. Cassandra's fight was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about proving that the system could work for those who had been historically excluded from it. In the midst of it all, Cassandra received a message from a source deep inside the political machinery, a high-ranking official in the Senate Judiciary Committee. The message was clear. Her nomination was in jeopardy, and her fight for justice had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. Her battle with Judge Hawkins was far from over, but now it had the added weight of an entire nation's expectations. The world was watching, and Cassandra knew that if she wanted to make it to the Supreme Court, she would have to outlast this storm and prove that no amount of political maneuvering or bias could silence her pursuit of justice. The battle for Cassandra Green's future had reached a boiling point. With each passing day, the pressure grew, and the walls of the political and legal arenas seemed to close in around her. Her case had become the subject of relentless media coverage, political debates, and public protests. But now, as her fight for justice intensified, so did the sense of betrayal from those she had trusted. It wasn't just Judge Hawkins who posed a threat. Cassandra was beginning to realize that the very system she had spent her career fighting for was the one threatening to tear her down. Inside her legal team, the once unified front began to crack. There were whispers about whether Cassandra's Supreme Court nomination could survive the ongoing controversy. Some of her most trusted advisors were now questioning whether she should distance herself from the public battle and focus on securing her place on the court. The question had lingered, unspoken, in the back of her mind for weeks. Was the fight worth it if it cost her the opportunity to change the system from within? But Cassandra knew the answer. She could never remain silent in the face of injustice. To step away from this fight now would be a betrayal. not just of the people who had supported her, but of everything she had spent her life working for. Every day she heard stories from individuals who had been wronged by the system, voices that were often ignored. Her own struggle was a reflection of the larger battle for equality and fairness, and she could not allow herself to back down, no matter the personal cost. As the investigation into Judge Hawkins deepened, cracks began to form in the facade of the legal system. The more his past came to light, the harder it became for anyone to deny that his ruling had been influenced by political motivations. Allegations surfaced that Hawkins had coordinated with conservative political groups to target progressive activists like Cassandra. The idea that a judge could use his position of power to sabotage someone's career, and possibly their future, became a rallying cry for those calling for judicial reform. The Senate Judiciary Committee, tasked with confirming Supreme Court nominees, was torn between supporting her and bowing to the political pressure mounting against her. Cassandra's reputation was being scrutinized more than ever. Her opponents had seized on every aspect of her career, attacking her views on criminal justice, her advocacy for marginalized communities, and even her integrity. The media painted her as a polarizing figure, as if her ideals alone made her unfit to serve. The attacks were ruthless, but Cassandra remained unbowed. If she were to be judged, she would face that judgment head-on. It was during this tumultuous period that Cassandra received a phone call that would change everything. A senior member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, someone who had once been a staunch supporter of her nomination, told her that her confirmation was in jeopardy. The Senate had been flooded with calls, letters, and petitions against her. Some of the most powerful voices in the Republican Party were mobilizing to oppose her, using her legal battles as evidence that she was too divisive to serve on the Supreme Court. The call felt like a gut punch, but Cassandra didn't allow herself to react emotionally. She had always known that the road to the Supreme Court would be hard, but now it seemed even more treacherous. The political establishment, so quick to embrace her when she was a symbol of hope, was now treating her like a threat. It was a familiar feeling, the sense that the system didn't want change, that the powers in control would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. But Cassandra had been underestimated before, and she would not let that happen again. With renewed resolve, she began to organize a national campaign to defend her nomination, focusing on the values that had shaped her entire career: justice, equality, and the unflinching belief that the law should serve the people, not the powerful. She rallied allies from across the political spectrum: progressives, moderates, even some conservatives who believed in the need for judicial reform. The fight was far from over, but Cassandra knew that the future of the court and the future of justice itself depended on her not backing down. The moment of truth was coming. The Senate would vote soon, and Cassandra's fate would be decided. She stood at the precipice of history, aware that whatever happened next would shape the direction of her life and the nation's legal system for decades to come. As the days ticked down to the Senate's vote on her confirmation, Cassandra Green felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She was no longer just an activist, a lawyer, or a civil rights advocate. She was a symbol. Her struggle had transcended the courtroom, becoming a national conversation about the future of the Supreme Court, the integrity of the justice system, and the fight for equality in America. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the scrutiny was relentless. But what kept Cassandra going wasn't the pressure. It was the conviction that she was right, that this fight, no matter how fierce, was one worth winning. Behind the scenes, her legal team worked tirelessly, strategizing for every possible outcome. They had already filed multiple motions to challenge the biased ruling of Judge Hawkins, hoping that the mounting evidence of his political affiliations would create enough doubt to undermine the legitimacy of the trial. At the same time, Cassandra's campaign team was mobilizing, reaching out to key senators, influential political figures, and grassroots activists to sway the opinion of those on the fence. They needed every vote, every voice in support of her. The political machinery was in full motion, working with all the tools at its disposal. But it wasn't just about the political insiders or the legal strategies anymore. It was about the people. Cassandra had always known that real change came from the ground up. And now, as her supporters took to the streets in even larger numbers, the energy of the movement filled her with renewed determination. Marches and rallies sprang up across the country, with protesters holding signs demanding justice, supporting her nomination, and calling for an end to the very biases that had led to her sentencing. Social media was flooded with messages of encouragement, and the hashtags hashtag #CassandraForestCOTUS and hashtag NotGuilty continued to trend. It was in the middle of one of these rallies, as Cassandra stood before a crowd of thousands, that she felt a powerful moment of clarity. She spoke about her journey, about the countless people she had represented, the cases she had fought, and the injustices she had seen. She talked about the moment when she first decided to become a lawyer, how she had looked at the system, at the disparities, and had vowed to never stop fighting for the voiceless. She spoke with passion, her words carrying through the crowd as they cheered, not just for her, but for the values she embodied: justice, equality, the belief that the law could and should be a force for good for everyone. Her speech was shared across social media platforms, turning into a viral sensation. The public support for Cassandra surged even higher. It was a turning point. She realized that no matter what happened in the Senate vote, she had already won something more important. She had ignited a movement. She had inspired people to take a stand, to demand more from their leaders and their courts. And she knew that this fight was far from over, regardless of the outcome. The night before the vote, Cassandra sat in her apartment, alone with her thoughts. She had given everything she had to this cause: her career, her reputation, her peace of mind. Tomorrow, the Senate would decide her fate. She thought back to all the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. Every time, she had found a way to rise above, to prove that she belonged. This was no different. The vote would be close, but she knew deep down that she had made her case, not just as a nominee, but as a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice. It wasn't just about becoming a Supreme Court justice anymore. It was about something much larger. It was about whether the nation would rise to meet the challenges of equality and fairness, or whether it would continue to let fear and power shape its future. The next morning, the halls of the Senate would be packed. The fate of Cassandra Green and the future of the Supreme Court hung in the balance. The morning of the Senate vote arrived, and with it, a heavy sense of anticipation. The air was thick with tension as Cassandra sat in her office, glued to her phone and television, watching the live feeds from the Capitol. Every word spoken in the Senate, every vote cast, could determine her future. It felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for: the countless hours in courtrooms, the sleepless nights spent strategizing, the sacrifices of those who had fought alongside her. This wasn't just her moment. It was the moment for the people whose voices had been silenced for too long, for those who had never given up hope that the law could be an instrument of real change. Outside the Senate building, a sea of protesters had gathered, some waving banners, others holding signs bearing the words "Justice for All" and "Cassandra Green for Supreme Court." The energy in the air was palpable. It wasn't just about a court ruling or a political battle anymore. It was a movement that had taken on a life of its own. Cassandra had become the face of a fight much larger than her own. Inside the Senate chamber, the debate was fierce. Senators who had once supported her were now questioning whether she was the right fit for the Supreme Court. The attacks on her past activism and the controversies surrounding Judge Hawkins had made her an increasingly polarizing figure. Yet, despite the opposition, there was a powerful undercurrent of support from those who had watched her rise from a young activist to a fierce advocate for justice. They saw her not as a threat to the establishment, but as the embodiment of what the court needed: someone who would challenge the status quo and push for a more just and equitable society. As the vote began, Cassandra held her breath. She had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the feeling of watching her fate be decided in real time. Her heart raced as the names were called, one by one, the senators' votes echoing in the room. The first few votes were in her favor, then a few against. The tension mounted. Every single vote felt like a weight, pushing her closer to either triumph or defeat. Finally, the last vote was cast. The room fell silent as the final tally was announced. 52 in favor, 48 against. It was a narrow victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Cassandra Green, the woman who had been unjustly punished by a biased judge who had fought against a system designed to hold her back, had just made history. She had secured her place as the next Supreme Court Justice of the United States. The Senate erupted into applause, some standing in admiration, others sitting in stunned silence. Cassandra's supporters cheered, while her detractors were left with nothing but the reality of the moment. The system had tried to break her, to silence her, but in the end, it was the very system that had fought against her that had validated her. She was now part of the institution she had long sought to reform, a testament to the power of perseverance, courage, and unyielding faith in justice. Cassandra rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the room as she absorbed the magnitude of what had just transpired. Her legal team, her family, and her closest allies surrounded her in a sea of congratulations, but Cassandra only had one thought on her mind. This victory was just the beginning. The work was far from over. Now, as a Supreme Court justice, she had the power to influence the course of the nation's future, an opportunity she would use to fight for justice, equality, and the people who needed it most. As she walked toward the exit, a wave of emotion hit her. It wasn't just about the title, the victory, or the honor. It was about the realization that, against all odds, she had made it. The fight for justice was never going to be easy, but Cassandra Green had shown the world that it was always worth fighting for. And as the cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, she smiled, knowing that her journey was far from over. The real work had only just begun.